Well, welcome everybody to the AMSSM webinar series. My name is Dr. Mike Galbraith. I'm a primary care sports medicine physician in the bustling metropolis of East Texas, and I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Nicholas Burd here in just a moment. This webinar is part of our AMSSM Sports Economics Committee series. And Dr. Nicholas Burd will be speaking to us here in just a couple minutes about the role of partnerships and funding in science. So basically, you can imagine there's a bunch of these, especially young, up and coming, promising sports medicine physicians saying, hey, I want to get involved in research, but I have no idea maybe where to start or how do I get funding for that? So hopefully we can address some of those things. For some housekeeping items, we just ask that you mute your microphones. And if you have questions, please leave those questions in the chat. We'll do our best here at the end of the session to answer as many of those questions as we can. A couple reminders also, we do have the annual AMSSM Sports Medicine Conference in my hometown of Seattle, Washington, coming up here in April. Registration will open up here in just a few weeks in January, so stay tuned. Also, some exciting things with this Sports Economics Committee. Here in 2026, we're going to start doing something a little bit different. We're going to have some short, kind of mini video series, probably about 4 to 5 minute videos talking about various billing and coding issues. And I think that can maybe reach some key target audiences. So stay tuned with that. Now to introduce Dr. Nicholas Burd. He's originally from the great state of Ohio, an official Ohio State Buckeye. He completed his undergrad and master's degree in Indiana, but still definitely roots for the Buckeyes, it sounds like. Uh, who would have thought maybe he could be divided like Indiana could be a powerhouse there? He completed his PhD in the warm climates of McMaster's in Ontario, Canada, followed by his postdoc in the Netherlands. Currently, Dr. Burd is a professor in the Department of Health and Kinesiology and the Division of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His work focuses heavily on exercise physiology and also protein metabolism. With his line of work, he has been involved in many, many research opportunities. He has a wealth of navigating both federal funding, such as the NIH and the USDA, in addition to various industry partnerships. He's authored more than 130 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. And so that means he's pretty much an expert and expert in doing research and then therefore an expert in trying to find funding for research. He's a member of the American College of Sports Medicine, the ACSM, in addition to multiple other professional societies. Welcome, Dr. Burd. We're excited to learn from you. Feel free to take over and share your screen and teach us.
Yep, absolutely, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. Like I said, when I'm teaching my students, I always tell them an expert is just somebody who's made every mistake in a very narrow field. So yeah, you're correct. I've made a lot of mistakes in a very narrow field, which by definition, I guess, has made me an expert. So just give me 1 second here to share my screen. Yeah, no, as Mike noted, I do appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about, something other than strictly research or protein metabolism, but in particular, covering this topic that's relevant to all of us, certainly given the climate of the funding within recent years. So overall, I'll be speaking a little bit about at least from my perspective, the role of industrial partnerships and funding in science. So here's sort of the outline for today. First off, briefly just touch a little bit about me and then certainly get down to the brass tacks, speaking to the roles industry plays, the benefit it brings, and then the risk it introduces, and then some public outreach, educational efforts, which sort of go hand in hand with all research, but even more so with industrial-based funding. So I won't spend a lot of time here because Mike did an excellent job, but I always like to highlight that, a lot of my success certainly has nothing to do with me, but it has everything to do with my research team. So maybe to a less extent to the topic I'm talking about today, but certainly my success in achieving funding is due to their efforts. So I have a wonderful team supporting me as well, which obviously any strong researcher needs a strong support system. So I'm fortunate to have that. Um, just up top here, it's obviously pertinent to all conversations, but certainly this one. Just wanted to highlight, I have received, as noted, funding from industrial-based sponsors for the past 13 years or so. I did want to note here, I currently do not have any consulting roles or ownership in sponsoring companies. Or in other words, I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose at this time. So just to try to help me make a greater connection to certainly the audience, I recognize we have a lot of um, physicians in sports medicine, but as I was talking to Mike earlier, I without the support of sports medicine physicians, my research couldn't actually move forward. As noted, one of my expertise is using stable isotope tracers to probe metabolism. So essentially, we infuse a stable isotope tracer that over time gets incorporated in the skeletal muscle tissue. Then I'll take muscle biopsies, and then we can get estimates of how our muscles are turning over and remodeling themselves. And again, these are routine, but certainly invasive. And without the support of and partnership with local sports medicine physicians, like I said, I couldn't be as successful as I have. And I admittedly, partly that, here in the US, there's less doing these kind of tools. So I've been fortunate enough to train with some of the best in the world to bring some of that knowledge back stateside. And largely using this tool and technology has allowed me some success. A lot from sports nutrition companies. So I'll be bringing that perspective and how, I've been funded through those kind of channels to achieve the money that I've achieved over the years. So, getting back to what we want to talk about is, what role does industrial sponsored research play in sports medicine? I did want to highlight that this is sort of my story and my perspective. Every experience is going to be a little different. Every partnership is a little different. It's going to be unique and individualized, but I just wanted to try to package everything up to provide at least some type of journey I've been on to help, frame this whole idea of industrial partnership in research. So obviously, one role it has, it's complementary, in terms of industrial-based money with industrial-based, or I'm sorry, with federal funding. So I always view government grants more as the basic research, the concept, right? Without that basic research, I have no compass to navigate, right? And then industrial sponsorships is really this in translational work. Okay, it allows us to I can really innovate the field. I must admit, industrial money is beautiful because maybe a little higher risk studies, but there's more rapid demand, shorter timelines that, you can literally see, within a year or two, what we tested, you can see on the market, right? Which is amazing. You just don't see that with basic research, right? But, in terms of funding, the funding is different, right? So when you view government grants, this is going to be more cost reimbursement. The university would view this sort of low payment risk, right? I sort of noted here that payment risk with industrial sponsors is going to depend. It's going to depend who you're dealing with, what the company is. Are they a startup company? Um, University of Illinois is very supportive, but again, we got to balance. They do have a risk assessment, where they'll sort of dictate, maybe this isn't the safest route, maybe this isn't the best bet, for you to accept this funding line, right? In terms of timeline, I sort of alluded to completely different, right? Government grants are going to be longer term. Industrial sponsorship grants are going to be shorter term, right? Then the bottom line here, obviously, that most, at least from a university's perspective, is, the indirect cost recovery. It's going to be different, right? This is sort of the keep your lights on fees. And when you're dealing with industrial sponsors, this can vary from university to university, right? So if I do an industrial sponsor clinical trial, the indirect costs are going to be 26%, right? I deal with a food commodity board, it could be as low as 10%. The University of Illinois, federal funding is closer to 57%, right? So the indirect cost recovery rates are going to vary, right? But you can kind of appreciate with industrial sponsors, the industrial, or I'm sorry, the indirect cost recovery is going to be a little, it's less time invasive. These are little smaller studies, something we can knock out. So I think they're willing to balance that a little bit, but obviously, it just takes a lot of communication with whoever, whatever office, whatever funding office you're dealing with. Like again, I have a great relationship with the University of Illinois, but certainly, you just have to have an open line of communication to weigh all these pros and cons, but they do have a complementary role with each other in terms of government grants and industrial sponsors. So I wanted to sort of also, obviously this is a great opportunity for education, sort of clear up some misconceptions surrounding industrial-based grants. So this is a common belief, and this is something that my mentor up in Canada put together, Professor Stuart Phillips, comes from a piece he wrote several years ago. But essentially, what he's highlighting here, what a lot of people believe, how industrial contract works. For example, an industrial partner comes to the scientist with a research question. The industrial partner tells the scientist how much money they will give me to do the research, and then they pay me personally, right? And I sort of bolded that because that couldn't be further from the truth. And then he sort of listed different scenarios, how it might take place, right? Again, this is not how it works, right? This is exact opposite of how it works. So when I deal, at least from my experience with industrial contracts, there are different avenues of how I'm going to navigate this. Sometimes it's very, very, very competitive, right? Particularly when I'm dealing, or been funded through food commodity boards, right? So these are, at least from my perspective, I've received funding from dairy, beef, um, Opry, which is associated with potato, but release request for proposals, right? And usually there's a research theme associated with that, right? But sometimes if you have a good idea, I might submit, yeah, there's a research theme, but they always usually, with industrial-based sponsors, they might have one that sort of said exploratory in nature, right? Just to make sure, if you have a good idea, maybe it's not exactly in line with the research theme, but, you know, you just toss it in, right? And I've been successful in that front. Sometimes, a funding agency might not know exactly what they want until you tell them, right? But in recent years, I can say these have become highly competitive again with the struggles of federal funding. But how these work are, you wait for the research call to come out, whatever research theme, or you do the exploratory nature, you submit a letter of intent, fingers crossed, you get invited to submit a full grant. Obviously, you got to use um, whatever, this is SPA. This is where I submit my grant, all, all the checking to make sure everything's in line, ready for submission. And again, it's real important that, you you have somebody cross-check, right? Because again, the institution is going to absorb the risk by committing their own resources, including my time, facilities, institutional funds, so forth and so on. So you want to make sure you've checked all the boxes before, um, you don't get the letter of intent and then automatically just submit it. No, you got to go through the proper channels. Like I said, under the ideal settings, you get funded and then you complete the work. And certainly with this kind of approach, there's very little. I have the complete freedom to write the paper. There's really little to no industrial base or from the food commodity boards. They don't dictate how we publish. They don't dictate the messaging, so forth and so on. Another approach where I've had a lot of experience with is more of another avenue of industrial sponsors clinical trials. Okay. So this is a little different. So this is where a company might identify a hurdle. All right. And I have a specialized expertise. So a lot of times they'll reach out to me, via email and just inquire about our willingness to conduct whatever research question they have, right? So this is more targeted direct contact. Obviously, next goal is they're going to have me sign an NDA, right? Which is just a confidential relationship, to make sure I'm not sharing any information with the press or given to competitors, so forth and so on, right? And then next step is this clinical trial agreement. This is going to be heavily dictated by that industrial sponsor, right? And that's sort of why I wrote this. This can look very different. Okay. This is where, unlike the food commodity boards, this is where, you got to be a little more thoughtful, a little more tuned in to how these contracts are written. The university is going to be vetting these contracts a little heavier because they're a little different, right? And if I go back to that other notion that I highlighted earlier, this is what you will really want to be careful of. Um, University of Illinois is really thoughtful about making sure that we don't lose control of the data. Okay. So meaning this is a situation where an industrial partner might dictate whether or not we have the ability to publish, right? We're a training institution. I'm training graduate students. Obviously, my job is to try to position them to be successful in their next step. This is not positioning them to be successful if I allow us to conduct a study and then we are not able to publish it, right? Because that's obviously part of their degree program, right? So it's not to say you can't, you could, but again, that's going to be up to the investigator's discretion on how they want to navigate that. I generally prefer not to do that. Now, I can say a little trick you can do. It's not really a trick, it's just a reality. All right. Because ultimately, it's just balancing against this notion that I just noted I have graduate students. Their success certainly depends on my success, but I want to make sure I can cover their stipends, all right? Help facilitate their success through our program. So at some level, you do need money coming through the labs, right? So it's all this balancing pros and cons. Under these circumstances, if they want to try to prevent us from publishing, you might sunset it. Whereas you put a little note within the contract that, hey, in 5 years, or shorter, ideally, but worst case, 5 years, regardless of the situation, we're allowed to publish it, right? That's not great for graduate student training, but at least they still get a publication out of the efforts that was put into it. So again, this is going to look very different based on who you're dealing with, who is the sponsor, right? So this can be multiple avenues you're going to go through. Now, some other things, not to say this is a pros and con list. I don't like that. I think these are just considerations, right? But if we did want to label this as a pro, I do view these things as some positives, right? Again, part of my goal is to train future scientists, right? So sometimes a scientist or a graduate student might enter my lab thinking, I want to go to an R1 institution. I want to be a PI. Then they sort of see what goes into that. They're like, maybe I don't want to be a PI anymore. Maybe I want to go into industry, right? What better way to give them experience with dealing with industry is being exposed to that line of research, right? So again, it's great for networking. And I've actually had students under those exact scenarios come into my lab, PhD students, I really want to be a PI, and then they sort of see what goes into it, the struggles. I don't view it as stressful, but of course, I kind of enjoy the chaos of it all. But just depends how your mind is tuned. They might decide that I'm not saying the industry is safer by any means, but it's just a little different, right? So it provides them, and they also can gain those real world skills of dealing with industry, seeing how they operate, and it gives them sort of a leg up, perhaps, on some of the competition. The other issue, not the other issue, but the other positive is, as I noted earlier, industrial money is sort of milestone based, right? The funding period's a little shorter, which is a little nicer because it lines up with, students get more opportunities to publish. If we run a acute study that might take us a year, then we can generally, yeah, as you know, science moves slow, so it could take sometimes up to 9 months to get everything published. But again, their CV is their academic currency. So if I can build their CV, and these sort of shorter milestone-based studies allow me to build a CV, give them an opportunity to learn the publication process, and again, set them up for success. And of course, the other thing is it's important to, diversify revenue, especially in, like I said, sort of the state of current funding avenues is this gives you a little more financial stability. Again, it's going to be a little more short term, but still having that money through the lab, allowing me to train students, and still do good science, is a win in my book. Other things is, you know, again, I'm coming in from it more from a nutritional perspective. I've had the opportunity and access to some pretty cutting edge research tools, right? Because a company, what they're testing is a specialized nutrition product. So, it might not be readily available on the market, but gives me an opportunity to test and sort of, like I said, innovate and move the needle in my field, which is always a positive, right? Innovation is a key part of the scientific process. As noted, the other thing is due to the shorter timeline, it's really translational science, right? Basic science, not saying it won't ultimately be translational, but it's basic, right? This is a situation where within 2 years, I can see the product we just tested on the grocery store shelf. Incredible, right? And the other aspect, of course, is not I did spend some time up in Canada, so obviously I got to lean a little bit on Wayne Gretzky here. I always tell my students, in terms of should we go for this? The old saying is, yeah, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, but it does get exhausting when you're constantly shooting at federal funding in particular. Um, and you can experience that fatigue, right? Because it takes a long time to develop a federal grant. Um, Industrial-based sponsorship grants or however avenue, they're not as robust, right? And the success rate, at least in my hands, is a little higher. And so again, it can really cut down on that grant writing fatigue and keep you motivated, keep the team excited, and things like that. But balancing against obviously coming from an R1 institution or research intensive institution, it's important that I'm also trying to write federal grants. But again, this is a way for me to sort of, like I said, to kind of reduce that grant writing fatigue that is real. Everybody experiences it. It's not unique to me. I just wanted to highlight this. Another common question I receive all the time. Can academic scientists accept money from industrial partners? I mean, are we allowed? Yes, we are, right? In terms of the rules. So I can accept research grants, as noted. I can have consulting fees. I can sit on advisory boards. Again, these usually come with stipends. However, I must disclose all this information to the university, and I do have to do that quite frequently, right? What I do personally try to do is I do not serve as a consultant or an advisor on an advisory board of an agency or anybody where I'm ultimately going to be running a study related to it, right? This just elevates your COI risk. It's not worth it, right? Whatever small consulting fee you might receive leading into that study, it's just not worth the risk to me. So my personal perspective is, if you believe, this is something you might run with me, I'll do, some study design work up front. I don't want any consulting role, um, so forth and so on. Again, it has potential to elevate the COI risk if you're also serving a consultant on a study that you might run in the future. Um, Again, as noted, I don't really like this pro-con situation, but if we had to think about it through that lens, there are some potential cons, right? Things I'm looking for. Are there any publication restrictions? I sort of alluded to this earlier, right? This is going to have a negative impact on my graduate student training, right? That's a problem. Again, that's one of my major goals is to train future scientists. So I got to be really thoughtful about that. I'm sure a lot of the physicians are viewing it through the same lens. The other thing is you don't want the scientific record to reflect marketing goals, right? Sort of turns into this distorted reality. So trying to make sure any study we run has some scientific merit. I do not, or I refuse to just serve as a sort of a commercial for any uh, any industrial partner, right? I do view it as a partnership. There has to be some type of science-related question involved in any work that we do, right? The other thing is making sure that, the sponsor isn't trying to, and that's part of that contract up front, trying to use any legal financial leverage to override your judgment, right? Those are the kind of companies you sort of, obviously that up front, you have those conversations, you sort of get an idea whether or not these are the kind of people you want to work with, right? Um, the other thing you need to account for is any skewed research agendas with study design and so forth. And I sort of will speak a little bit to this because this is going to feed directly into funding bias, right? Which is one of the the biggest issues if you accept industrial money that you're going to experience, right? Constant conversation about funding biases, right? And certainly if you investigate the literature, there's some support for that idea. So I'm not saying it's completely off base, right? Here's just a meta-analysis where they looked at um, 12 reports and they just were sort of assessing um, this funding bias notion with industrial sponsored research. And what they find was maybe not significant, but they highlighted perhaps maybe a 31% higher risk that when you compare federal versus industrial funding, there is a little higher risk associated with industrial money, right? Then you sort of got to take a look back, and that sort of comes down to how the study was designed, right? If you're doing a straw man comparison, in my case, again, I study a lot with protein metabolism. If somebody wants me to run a study where I compare eating protein in one trial and drinking water in the next, right? That's sort of leverage to support any industrial outcome, right? That's not really, in my opinion, moving the field in any direction, right? Another situation you might encounter, at least again in my hands, is a company wanting you to compare 30 grams of food protein contained in their product. Their control is contains 10 or 15 grams of food protein, right? Again, that can lead to a situation where you're favoring whatever product you're investigating, right? And then you might encounter, this notion that, again, based on this milestone-based short timelines, that positive studies are going to be rushed to publication, whereas negative studies it might be a little more blurred. And then again, I avoid these things, but you do hear whispers of outcome switching, right? A negative outcome is rebranded as a positive outcome. So again, a lot of this can be controlled internally by the scientists, right? So I'm not saying funding bias doesn't exist in research, right? It can exist, at least in terms of industrial-based funding, but again, it sort of comes down to the scientists making sure they're navigating and trying to sidestep those kind of potential issues, right? And here's a great example, right? So here's a, a couple studies where again, going back to, I think it speaks to some of the funding agencies I deal with, industrial sponsors I deal with. I was wrong in each case, right? This didn't actually support the hypothesis. And was there any interference for me to publish? No, zero, right? They just wanted to make sure, a lot of this was funded through food commodity boards, so perhaps a little different perspective. But one of their major goals is to educate the public, right? And so, they were nice enough to fund, not nice enough, but thoughtful enough to fund these studies that were a little higher risk, were going to allow me to innovate a field. But they did come back, I was wrong, right? And actually, it was, I kind of laughed the other day. A student came into my office and um, they were like, you've been wrong your last five hypotheses. And I'm like, oh, well, that's science. Those are the most interesting studies too. When, when you put your best guess forward and you're wrong, right? It makes you sort of reflect a little heavier. Um, some things I do to try to avoid that paid result fear or that funding bias fear. This is concern in every field, right? This concept of predatory journals. Right, and that notion is certain journals are less concerned about gatekeeping, more concerned about trying to collect open access fees. You know, I just avoid these kind of journals entirely, right? I'm not saying all journals are like this, but I just choose to avoid it. Other things I always look for, particularly if I'm reading science, is any shotgun approach to science, right? That's when there's no clear hypothesis, right? That allows a study to investigate multiple things and then they just sort of tune in to one aspect. And the other thing, and at least in my field and where I publish, this is an absolute. It's really, really important that before you run a clinical trial, you always pre-register it. I use clinicaltrials.gov, right? And that sort of help keeps a high integrity of the study. It's been pre-registered, and it's actually part of the Declaration of Helsinki. So obviously you should be doing that anyway, from an ethical perspective. But pre-register, then anybody can clearly go on. It's been registered before the study was even ran. They can see what your primary outcomes were, secondary outcomes, so forth and so on. But again, the reality is industrial money comes with increased public scrutiny. I mean, it's just the situation, right? But I always view this as a very interesting aspect of industrial money that I do encounter quite frequently. And again, I don't view it as a negative per se, because as I tell my students all the time, science is not a belief system, right? And I'll speak a little further to that notion on the next slide, but certainly as a scientist, we encourage readers to critically assess study design. But what I do recommend is that they always sort of balance it and evaluate it against the backdrop of the study design, right? And normally, I do appreciate it when readers try to hash it out via email. Sometimes the tone is a little aggressive, but again, maybe I just sometimes view that as passion. But I do get a lot of this hostile correspondence, and it probably could be more related to the notion of, protein nutrition research is there's a lot of passionate, not only consumers, but also researchers in this area. But sometimes, you just can't solve it. It's not going to work through the back and forth over email. And sometimes, usually I just say, hey, you know what? This is not very productive for either one of us. Ultimately, sometimes I say, write a letter to the editor and we'll take it up and run it through the peer review process. It's just more productive. And, when we do that as well, if a particular reader is having a question related to something, there's probably others who have the same question. So now we can get it out into a scientific forum. Let's 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 hash it out, like I said, but let's do it through a peer review process where it's less hostile per se, and we can have clearer minds. The other thing is, of course, as I receive this all the time, again, could be the nature of the protein nutrition based research I do. I get a lot of conflict of interest accusations. Again, I think it comes back to the notion that I am not receiving, there's no money from any study run that's going into my bank account. It just doesn't happen, right? I might be able to, obviously fund the research, fund some of my students, but that's just normal part of education, right? So I get a lot of conflict of interest accusations. It does add some hoops and hurdles to my life, right? Now I have the university investigating it. That's fine. That's okay. I'm happy to do that. But I also wanted to make people aware that, as scientists, we're very thoughtful about this, right? So a lot of times I'll have, before I even submit a study, I submit it higher up in the university and say, could you just review to make sure I'm not missing any conflict of interest, right? Because again, it's all about transparency. That's science. We don't want to hide anything, right? And then I just sort of closed everything up there on the bottom. Just, again, coming back to this whole issue of public scrutiny, scientific truths are not static. Future studies, may prove us wrong, but that's science, right? That's just part of what we do. That's the beauty of science, right? And this is always what I'm telling my students. Science is not a belief system. It's when I hear somebody say, just trust the science, I usually say, please don't, right? That's not great for science, right? People need to challenge it. They need to criticize it. They need to force us and others to try to replicate it, right? I don't care if it's coming from industrial-based money or federal funding. I mean, that's the basis of science, right? And, this is just framing this a little more just to make sure that, you know, science is not this belief system notion, because it doesn't ask you to believe based on dogma, right? It asks you to accept the result only because it survived repeated attempts to disprove it, right? And we have avenues to help, before it obviously reaches the greater masses, right? It does undergo peer review. And trust me, through this process, there is a lot of debate, there's a lot of scrutiny, right? But again, it's just the first step of science, right? It only becomes reliable when other independent scientists, can follow our same methods and get the same results, right? That's just the fundamental nature of science. So again, when I say, the hostile correspondence, I welcome that. I think it's healthy for science, right? Again, sometimes the tone can be a little less mean per se. You'd be surprised some of the emails I get, but again, I think it's healthy for science. I don't discourage that by any means. I just pulled this up because it was interesting. I caught this in the Washington Post. This was based off of one of our past efforts, where again a study was funded through an industrial sponsor. I was wrong. It was just comparing, animal versus vegan based eating patterns against the backdrop of weightlifting. But I found this quote very interesting as part of this news article. Essentially, what we found in this study was that there was no difference between eating a vegan-based meal pattern versus eating an animal-based, which was sort of against perhaps what has been put out in the general public. But again, this author just made this quote, hey, if the beef industry says it doesn't matter, who's going to argue? But again, yeah, the beef industry or the beef checkoff might have sponsored this study, but they didn't they didn't say that. Again, because they don't have any role in our interpretation of it, right? Well, again, there is these more a lot of these food commodity boards. That's why I love working with them because their goal is just to educate the public, right? For better or for worse, right? So again, it's sometimes I think that gets skewed, right? Again, they had nothing to do with the outcome, right? So I mean, you can argue it or not, or perhaps argue with me, but they had nothing to do with it. Again, I always like this quote, and one of my training notions. And again, I think what a lot of people forget, most scientists follow the same sort of quote or approach that the intensity of conviction that a hypothesis is true has no bearing on whether it's true or not, right? That's just as scientists, that's how we operate. You know, I'm not, that's the beauty of it. Actually, it's kind of more interesting when we don't find our hypothesis, right? Then we have to go back and reflect and test again to see, like again, that's the beauty of it. That's the exciting part, right? When we're wrong. I find that very interesting. Um, Again, I use this quote because I've sort of noted this, my mentor Stu Phillips followed this belief, but this notion that as scientists, we do have a responsibility. It doesn't stop at the publication, right? He's always trained us to remember that we do have a responsibility to translate our research because if we don't do it, somebody else will. And guess what? They're going to get it wrong, not because they want to, because they don't have their finger on the pulse like we do, right? So as again, it doesn't really matter if it's federal or industrial, but certainly I think we have a greater as scientists doing industrial-based research, we got to be a little more thoughtful about, spreading the right message from a particular study, right? To prevent the misinformation, right? To help build public trust, make sure that the public is making informed decision making. And ultimately, you could argue that it comes down to it is an ethical responsibility as a scientist that we do our best to disseminate the research in the cleanest manner. And this is where social media comes into play, right? I know as physicians, you're even more busy than, an academic, but I recognize that, often, I have to reflect a lot. You know, it's so hard to get things published, so much work goes into it, you're sort of exhausted. But again, I have to go back to, what my mentor Stuart Phillips says, we have that responsibility. It doesn't stop at the publication, right? We have to use social media because it's allowing us to bridge that gap, right? And we can translate, whether it's through infographics or visual abstracts, so forth and so on. We have an avenue to directly speak to the practitioners, right? And again, another avenue is healthy for science, right? It's rapid translation. You're getting peer review in the real time, right? Now it's a balance. Of course, I generally one of the rules I have is don't read the comments, right? Because, nobody, usually a lot of those comments aren't like, oh, um, Dr. Burd, this was a beautiful study, right? No, it's nothing but negative. But again, so it's a balance of you could spend all day reading negative comments, but it does sometimes when you have a academic discussion on those higher levels, it's like, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. That's a good thought that I did not think about, and I need to think about when I educate further, whether it's in a talk or, when I'm thinking about study designs, right? So I can learn a lot from that. Again, it's a balance because you can lose a lot of time. I'm nearing the end of this conversation, but Louise Burke is somebody who I looked up through the year, one of these brilliant sort of scientists, practitioner, um, and this is several years old, a piece that she wrote, but just, trying to um, for scientists just trying to frame, when you're communicating sports science, in the age of, social media, um, it is important, right? Because again, if we don't translate it, somebody else will. And this concept of sports science-ness, if you will, right? It's important that you separate the scienciness from the science. And the only way we can do that is by, serving on the front lines and, advocating and translating. And then, part of that paper, she also highlights a very good point, right? Particularly from even nutrition, but I am trained as an exercise physiologist, so every study I conduct, I look at it against the backdrop of exercise, right? And as physicians, that's better than all of us, or sports medicine doctors, that you can't view it in a silo, right? One of the strongest things we have in our life to promote human health is increasing physical activity and exercise, right? But unfortunately, a lot of times exercise can be a low priority um, sort of status within a company. So, um, but where I can get a lot of my money to do the exercise work is through some of these industrial partnerships. So again, right, ideally in an ideal setting, yeah, I can get these big 5-year grants, allow me to do, the in vivo human metabolic research, use exercise intervention, use real world nutritional aspects um, to drive my research questions. But again, sometimes there's just a disconnect with what, the basic or the federal funding wants to publish versus perhaps what I view as true innovation, right? And this is where the industrial partnerships come into play, right? So just to wrap things up here, sort of what we discussed was, why I like industrial-based money. It does allow for, at least in my experience, it allows me to move the needle in the field, right? It allows me to not only do that, but diversify my research, my revenue streams, allows me access to these novel research tools. And again, it ensures the research we're doing is practical and urgent. Um, again, as I said, sometimes as part of accept they're doing this kind of work, you're going to perhaps get increased scrutiny. Again, not necessarily bad per se, but it is a reality. So it's important that you do pre-register your clinical trials, be completely transparent in your disclosures, and then try to use, as opposed to perhaps using predatory journals, focus on using journals that are tried and true in your field, have a rich history. And those tend to be where I like to go. And again, communication is key, education is key, right? You should encourage people to ask the hard questions, but again, not assume all industrial science is dishonest. And like I said, and it's healthy, right? Science is not a belief system. Our credibility comes from the peer review and the ability to withstand scrutiny. And so, again, all of that, sort of, the beauty of industrial money is, yeah, you're going to get increased scrutiny, but again, it's sort of good for science, right? It forces you to think outside the box and be a little more rigorous with your study designs, so forth and so on. But that's all I have. I wasn't paying attention to time, but I'm certain we have some things on the back end or some time for questions.
You bet. That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burd. I appreciate you tackling. This is a difficult topic, especially in the field of sports medicine. Quite a few sports medicine physicians will be involved in research, some even as primary authors, but like to actually secure the funding, that we're not really as familiar with. So this is a topic that I'm not familiar with. So thank you, as a specialist in this field, giving us your words of wisdom and insight. I might jump into the questions if you don't mind here in the chat. Thank you again for everyone for participating, joining in. We know we have some people on the line now, and in the future we'll have some people join in. I will pop in. So Dr. Elliott, who he'd said, how are industry sponsored research typically secured? Are the sponsors finding you, or do you usually pitch to the sponsors?
Yeah, that sort of goes sort of what there's two avenues. Sometimes it's a simple request for proposals, right, with a very specialized research theme. And again, I always throw those in. That's going to be highly competitive. Particularly, when you talk to a lot of the industrial sponsors that are utilizing requests for proposals, their submissions, letter of intents, have increased dramatically in
Mm,
recent years, partly because of that, with the federal funding perhaps being a little more volatile, a little harder to get. So some of these
mm,
people who have traditionally had success with federal funding have found themselves less successful and now have had to pivot to using the industrial based money. But again, it's this is why it's good, how I write an industrial based grant is very different than how I write a federal grant, right? So so if you try to write a federal grant, use that sort of framework and put it into an industrial based grant, it's not going to work. They're completely different
mm,
avenues. So so there's a lot, with my students, there's a lot of grant writing classes, and I do encourage them to take them. But I'm like, it's, you're constantly pivoting all the time, right? So it's part of learning how to navigate. I was fortunate enough to learn the industrial-based systems from working with, my PhD. We did a lot of industrial-based work, and then when I went to the Netherlands, again, got a lot of exposure, and that's partly why I went abroad. It was a balance of if I stay stateside, I'll learn the NIH system really well, right? If I go abroad, it's going to get me out of that system, but I'm going to see a unique perspective. And I was like, I really
mm,
want that perspective. So I went that way and it just happened to work out, right? But again, I come back here, I'm a little less familiar with the the NIH system. So again, there's no right answer. It's just it varies. And the other avenue is, like I said, I do have a specialized research technique that very few laboratories in the world can do it. It's very
mm.
translational. So I'm fortunate enough, I do get direct contact, right, where they reach out to me. And again, I'm thoughtful about it. Like I'm not constantly chasing work. If it's not a good situation for my team, I just won't do it, right? I'm
Mhm.
never desperate for money. I don't, that's a very bad place to be, right? Again, so I always say if I'm not having fun, what's the point? And if I get involved with industrial contract that's not making it very enjoyable, it's just not worth it to me. So
Mhm.
again, yeah, it depends. It really does depend.
I jotted down a few different questions. If you don't mind, I'll ask just a few more and then I won't keep you too long.
Yeah.
So I'm just pulling this up here. One is, you touched on this and I thought maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. A lot of people assume if a company pays for the study, they get to decide what the paper says. Can you maybe explain a little bit more why that just simply isn't true
Well,
and maybe how your university can protect you from that?
yeah, I mean, you're exactly. It can be true. I mean, let's be honest. It can be true, but but
Shouldn't be true.
no, I mean, but that comes back. It comes down to the upfront negotiating within that relationship, right? And at least I can only speak from the University of Illinois perspective. They are really protective and they do a beautiful job of making sure that we do not get involved in those situations where you might be forced or they might try to hide research, right? So that
Mm,
I always say it's a little above my pay scale because, that's when there's negotiations going on behind the scenes between my budget office and whatever industrial contract that's going on, right? Ultimately, they're real supportive, like this is the situation, Nick, you know, these are some things we highlighted and flagged you should be really thoughtful about. Um, Ultimately, they do leave the decision in the researcher's hand. But again, it comes down to being thoughtful with who you're getting involved with.
hmm
I mean, that's it. I mean, it all comes down to that upfront contract negotiation, right? And so, yeah, those are situations where you could get yourself in a situation where you do encounter the funding bias, the shotgun hypotheses, these kind of things, right? I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It's absolutely exist,
hmm
but you cannot, as a scientist, yeah, all we have is our integrity, right? So in science, if we lose our integrity, what's the point? So, my integrity is worth more than getting a few research dollars, right? You just don't want to be in that situation, in my opinion. Again, I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do. I'm just sharing a perspective, and that's just how I
Right.
handle it. I'm not saying it's right, it's wrong, it could be wrong. That's just how I view it.
So Dr. Hugh has another question, says, with research funding being variable and academic institutions pushing for research funding, do you foresee industry funding becoming more prevalent than federal funding in the future?
It has in recent years, right?
Mhm.
The first thing before I accepted this job, again, obviously in academia, it doesn't matter if it's academia, it's hard to get a job, right? So one of the conversations I had with the leadership up front, and knowing, again, my training came from that avenue, what is your view on industrial money, right? Some institutions
Yeah.
could view it as a negative. University of Illinois, um, didn't, right? But they are thoughtful about the ICR, right? So, yeah, I mean, that's just the balance, right? The indirect cost recovery. If I try to get a grant with 0% ICR,
Hmm.
you can justify it, get permission, but you're going to get a little more scrutiny. So again, institution dependent, University of Illinois, highly supportive. They recognize that, um, you know, regardless of the ICR rates, it's beneficial. Again, we're a training institution. It's beneficial to be able to train graduate students. It's beneficial to get these publications out for the University of Illinois, right? So they have a very good perspective on it. And I could say perhaps other institutions are not, you know, maybe as noted by the question, yeah, maybe their perspective changing, but at least from a University of Illinois perspective, they've always been supportive. But that was something I vetted up front before I accepted the job because I knew
Hmm.
it was going to be an important part of the research I do.
Maybe I'll ask one last question here as we're winding down, if that's okay. And,
Yeah.
in summary, if there is maybe one takeaway you want sports medicine physicians to leave with today, specifically talk about industry funding, what is maybe one myth or that you'd want to bust? What would that be?
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to what I say, it comes back to that very notion. Um, it's not all bad.
Yeah. It can be
I'm,
good.
it can be good. And
Uh-huh.
again, it is actually, you should be critical. You should do that. I appreciate that, right? It's this thing where, like I said, if anybody ever tries to say, trust the science, don't trust it. Never trust it. Be critical about it. Scrutinize it. Force the scientists
Hmm.
to scrutinize their data. That's the foundation of science, right? It's never going to be a belief system. So I appreciate that. I
Hmm.
do. So again, yeah, be critical, but be thoughtful. I mean, that's it, right? I mean, not all scientists who do industrial-based research have some hidden agenda. They're not getting paid, right? I mean, they're literally, like I said, I received zero money from
Yeah.
zero
Well, it
money.
makes me
Right.
think, there's many sports med docs, they want to get plugged into research, and maybe
Yeah.
they don't know, they don't have maybe the connections and networks that you're talking about. This maybe emphasizes to me is maybe we shouldn't be concerned about trying to align ourselves with a research group that has affiliations with or that's been accepting some funding from some of these
No, I
industrial
mean,
groups, right?
yeah, it all comes down, I mean, it all
Hmm.
comes down to, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It does happen. You just got to be
Hmm.
thoughtful with the relationships. And like I said, the sports physicians I work with, um, I appreciate everything they do. I would never get them in a position where I might compromise anything. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because without them, I can't do the research I do. So I'm heavily dependent on them, and I've been very fortunate that to have that mutual trust, right? I'm very fortunate to do the research I do because of individuals like yourself, because of the sports medicine physicians, right? So it is really a partnership and relationship. Um, and so, yeah, they trust me, and obviously I trust them. So, I mean, it's just finding the right researcher that, ultimately is thoughtful, right? And I encounter scientists who are less thoughtful, right? But you'll see that in any
Hmm.
field, anywhere, right? You should be, like I said, be critical, but also be thoughtful. And I wouldn't automatically, just because somebody's doing industrial-based research, think that, again, there's some hidden agenda, there's some right? But not saying you shouldn't vet their conflict of interest, right? That's important that you're thoughtful about all these things because it does happen, right? So again, that's just part of the education component
Mhm.
is being thoughtful and being, yeah, and being critical. And again, like I said, I imagine with same with me. All you have in your field is your integrity. If you lose that, it's hard to gain it back, right? And it's easy to
Well,
lose if
this,
you work with the wrong people.
yeah. Well, this has been wonderful, and I think it may even just plant a seed in many sports medicine physicians that are kind of toying about research. Okay, now maybe this is triggered. Where can I turn? Who can I align with? What research team? Some people may have some questions about how can they contact you. Now, if I remember correctly, on the very first introductory slide that you had, I think it had your contact information. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my email address. I mean,
Perfect.
yeah, I'm less active on social media, so if you try to get me that avenue, I'm not on there
Wonderful.
as much. But shoot me an email. I'm always happy to have a discussion about whatever. I appreciate it. I mean, that's part of my job as
That's
working at a
great.
public institution. That's part of my service commitment. So
Well, we appreciate
happy to chat.
your willingness to take the time to prepare, to present, and maybe even answer some more questions in the future. So thank you so much, Dr. Bird, for your time. Also, for the audience, just a reminder, the AMSSM has a very active YouTube channel, including the Sports Economics Committee. Stay tuned. You can access that channel if you want to access any more of our Sports Economics Committee videos that have been fantastic, like the one presented by Dr. Bird. So thank you for your time, everyone, and have a wonderful night.